Welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician Licensing class. This is an online class started in October 2024. This is session 1. My name is David Okrent, Whiskey 7 Delta Alpha Oscar. I am your instructor for this course. I am an extra class operator, first licensed in 2008, and I believe the essence of amateur radio is the desire for human connection and community. I have a background in biomedical electronics as well as in product management and marketing, and I continue to have an interest in electronics, building antennas and other systems, as well as working with microcontrollers like the Arduino. Let's start with some of the introductory stuff for housekeeping for the course. If you have cameras, please turn them on if your surroundings are not distracting. Keep your microphone on mute unless you're asking a question. Attendance isn't taken. You can show up whenever you wish, and especially since these are recording. If you recorded sessions, if you miss a session, feel free to go to the site in the email to pick up the recordings and catch up. This course is about supporting you to get your license. If you feel you need to attend every class, attend every class. If you only want to attend certain sessions, that's fine too. All of this is to support you in getting your license. And as I said, I'll be recording the sessions so you can then look at them at a later time. There will be homework. I will assign it at each session, but it's only for you. It will not be turned in. It's just keeping you in motion to be able to stay current with the class and to check to see how your comprehension is doing. Also, as soon as you can, please set a date to take the test. Do commit to taking the test within 30 days from the last session while it's still fresh in your mind. Often people who put off taking the test never take the test. So in the PDF that you receive by email with resources, there's instructions for how to find a test locally or online. And please do make a commitment to take it with a certain amount of time. And even if it's online that you're choosing to take the test, please go ahead and schedule it now so you have a goal to work towards. Now, if 10 people are willing to commit to take a date and time, I'll set up a physical testing session in the Seattle area where you come in and sit down and take the test as a group. And a lot of people that way will set up a time that'll be literally within 1 week of taking the last session of the class, and therefore it'll be fresh in your mind. Also, in preparation for taking the test, please get your FRN this week. Again, see the PDF information sheet for how to do that. And if you have any questions between sessions, please do email me. Also email me if you're going to drop out of the course so I can stop sending you emails when we post things or send information to the class. And yes, do use online resources like YouTube, any phone apps for study aids, online practice tests. Whatever you can find to help you study and get through the material is great to do. This series is not the only way to get the information, so feel free to use any avenues you wish. By the way, the picture on the left is taken from about 10 years ago. It's me on my motorcycle, and I set up a mast on the motorcycle to put in a VHF-UHF J-pole, and I was operating as net control for an American Red Cross exercise that we're doing. So what you're not seeing is I would be sitting, leaning against the motorcycle with my handheld radio attached to that antenna, talking to people coming for the exercise. It's a little motorcycle mobile. Meeting times, MS Teams meeting room will open at 6:30 p.m. and close at 10 p.m. We'll take Q&As from 6:30 p.m. to 6:55 p.m. Class will start promptly at 7 p.m. and we'll do a break about every 50 to 60 minutes. I often operate portably at campsites or parks, and you're seeing on the right that I'm operating HF. I have a 16-foot telescoping whip on top of a coil with transmission cable going to my radio that is sitting on the picnic table. I do operate mostly in the shortwave bands. I occasionally operate VHF and UHF, but mostly I spend my time in the HF bands. The tech license focuses mostly on the rules of the road. At first, when you're looking through the book, it might look overwhelming with all the technical information, but once we get through the first 3 sessions, most of that technical information will be done, and the rest of the session will focus mostly on the rules of the road. So again, at first, if you have no background in this, you're going to be a little confused, a little overwhelmed. Just stay with it. As you stay with it, everything will coalesce and you'll find it will just flow together and you'll have the retention you need. The technical stuff for technician license is not that difficult. It just may be new. And so just keep that in mind as you're learning something new. You might get a little frustrated. Don't worry about it. Just push through it and you'll be fine. If you have questions, always email me and I'll be happy to answer them by email. If you're still having trouble, I'm happy to give you a call and we can talk about it on the phone. Now, some subjects will be covered at a deeper level than the book. However, you're only responsible for what is in the book. I often go a little bit deeper to give you a little bit better foundation and understanding of what's going on in the space of, for example, a component or how radio waves propagate. This is only for your background. It helps you as a foundation if you go on later to a general license. But again, the book at technician level is not as deep, and you're only responsible for what's in that book, and that is the arbitrator for what you need to know, rather than just what I'm going deeper on in some cases. So the subjects covered, and we'll cover them with a little bit further breakdown than this, but the subjects covered, of course, are Welcome to Amateur Radio, radio and signal fundamentals, as you can see, electricity, components and circuits, propagation, antennas and feed lines, radio equipment, communicating, license regulations, operating regulations, and safety. This is exactly the chapters that are in the book. I will be doing some sub-chapters as we go through here. And so just follow along in the book if you wish. But before a session or after a session, please do read the chapters that we're covering in the session and do the questions as they come up in the book. On the right is a dual band FM transceiver, VHF and UHF, and it's called the Bofang UV5 in this case, and it's a very popular, very inexpensive radio. So what do you need to know? Well, obviously you need to know the information to pass the test, but the key things you need to know for day-to-day operations as a ham radio operator and as a technician is what your license class band privileges are. That is, where you're allowed to operate, the operating rules and etiquette, how to program and use your radio. Now, specifically, we are not going to cover in detail how to program every different type of radio to be used with repeaters, and you'll learn about what repeaters are later, because they all are slightly different. However, when you own your own radio, it's important that you know how to manually program it and to program it with a computer. Most radios today are programmed, people find it easier to program by computer because it's less time consuming and you can clone or duplicate that programming with other radios fairly quickly. However, in times when someone needs to switch to a new repeater for various reasons, like different geography, an emergency situation where they change the private tones, you need to be able to know how to do it manually. So that's important to exercise that occasionally to remember how to do it. Some radios are a little straightforward, some radios are more complex. We also need to know you need to know how to power your radio, and then how to attach the radio to an antenna. On the right side, we've taken, this is just an illustration, but because it will look a lot more complicated in the sense of, the radio would be in one location and maybe 5, 10, 20, 30 feet away would be the antenna connected by a transmission line called coax. And so here we have a radio that would be hooked up to external battery instead of its internal battery, so it has a longer life capability for transmission. And we've hooked it up to what's called a quarter wave ground plane antenna. There's a little loop at the top so you can hang it up from the ceiling, from a tree, whatever you'd like to hang it from. And this antenna is very simple. It's about $4 antenna that you make yourself if you want to go that route. But it extends the range of that radio significantly because the antenna on these handheld radios are not very efficient. And by switching to an external antenna of better design, you get more range. So the same 5-watt output will go further than the standard antenna on a handy talkie like this. On the left, you'll see a dual band directional antenna called the Yagi. This has got the UHF, which is the smaller segments, and VHF, which are the longer segments. And this is hooked up to a handheld radio. And this person, generally speaking, is contacting someone via one of the amateur radio satellites, or they may be contacting the International Space Station, talking to one of the astronauts on the International Space Station. Yes, most of the astronauts on the ISS are amateur radio operators. They have an amateur radio station, and occasionally they will, on their off time, make contact as they're passing overhead with other hams. Many of the school interviews of ISS astronauts are conducted with amateur radio operators using the amateur radio equipment on board the ISS. And the ISS itself, when the ham radio equipment, has got two sets of ham radio equipment, one for the astronauts to use, and one is a system that is used for communication in general. So if the ISS is passing overhead and you want to relay messages through the satellite, the ISS is a satellite communication system, so you actually can use it like any other communication satellite. So again, we do have our own satellite network that amateur radio operators have had since the late 60s, I think, early 70s. So let's go into introduce ham radio to you now. And this is where we're now mostly focusing on what the content of the book is. So what's amateur radio? It's a personal radio service authorized by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. The amateur radio service encourages the advancement of the art and science of radio. There have been many times in the history of amateur radio where the work in amateur radio has been used in the commercial sector or to extend the science of radio. A lot of work is still being done by amateur radio operators on exploring the ionosphere and its effect on radio propagation through different atmospheric or stellar phenomena. So for example, during the last total solar eclipse, there were a number of amateur radio operators who were doing a study on how the eclipse affected radio propagation. So, and that could also, other things about radio design, like software-defined radios, different types of modulation techniques, different types of digital techniques, all have been developed by amateur radio operators. It also develops a pool of trained radio operators, so people who are very comfortable and know the etiquette, know how to operate and even set up radios. That trained pool is very useful because during emergency communication situations, many amateur operators will operate as auxiliary to the emergency operations centers of their local communities to staff radios as well as to create hubs where communications can be fed to the central EOC. And of course, that's in line with promoting the development of emergency communications capability to assist communities when needed. What that means is, unlike other emergency services, radio amateur operators have their own infrastructure. We each carry our own infrastructure with us. So if the entire communications infrastructure were to be gone, it would take very little time for amateur radio operators to reestablish communication. This happened in Australia when they had the major fires and most of the landlines and other things were destroyed in the fire. Very quickly, amateur radio operators could bring their radios online, build up their own communications network, including digital networks, and bring capabilities back to government agencies and others working in those areas. And of course, promoting international goodwill by connecting private citizens in countries around the globe. When you join as an amateur radio operator, especially if you're going to be working shortwave, long distance communications, you're part of a community that's global. You literally can step into another country, find the amateur radio club, and be welcome there, because it is a group of people who are connected by the hobby, and it's connected internationally. And when we talk to each other, especially over long distance, oftentimes we develop relationships with people if we have prolonged conversations over time. And oftentimes people will, when they visit a country, contact that person they've been talking to and get together. They might be introduced to the club. They might be maybe they want to operate in that foreign country for a short period of time, and the person they've been working with will get them in touch on how to get the authority to operate in a different country temporarily. So it is a global community, and you'll find that many, many different ham events around the world you can literally fly into, and you'll be welcome because it is that kind of community. So we're not like other radio services. We're not like GMRS, FRS, or CB. And why? Because we have fewer restrictions, we have more frequencies, we absolutely have more power because we can go up to 1.5 kilowatts or 1500 watts. We can operate from local to worldwide propagation. For example, even you as a technician with VHF, UHF, if you want to operate through a satellite, for example, you'd be operating in a distance of somewhere around 4,000 to 6,000 miles, making contacts through the satellite. They'd be quick contacts, but you would be able to do it. In comparison to a VHF UHF radio at about 5 watts would have a line of sight propagation that's probably more in the 5 mile range. So consider that small 5-watt radio with the right antenna using a satellite to communicate with and being able to bounce up to 4,000 or 6,000 miles away. There are many different types of operating modes that we have available to us. It's free spectrum. We don't pay for the spectrum that we use. It's been allocated to us. In fact, the allocation started over 100 years ago. We do self-police and we do self-test. So self-police means we do have people whose job it is, amateur radio operators who volunteer to monitor bands. And if somebody is operating incorrectly, they will break in and they'll say, hey, you might want to think about doing this. If someone is blatantly doing something to interfere with things, they will, and it's going over a course of time, they're constantly repeating a violation, they will contact the FCC and say, hey, this person is causing interference to others. We also were delegated by the FCC to test, so we'll learn about a little bit later. Amateur radio operators test people to become amateur radio operators. And this is different because back in 20 years ago or more, you had to go to an FCC field office to get tested. Picture on the right is two people assembling, getting a tower at a field day, which is a temporary event. And this is a little bit more extensive for field day, but they're in the process of getting the tower ready to accept a large antenna. That antenna is about 32 feet in length. So it'll be taking a whole team that will lift that antenna up and put it up on that tower, and they'll be operating for the weekend, and they'll take everything all down. That is the Mike and Key Radio Amateur Club at Fort Flagler in Washington State, and they've been at that location for about 45 years, the last weekend in June. And there's about eight or nine antennas that are set up across that park for us to operate from. So the essence of amateur radio really is public service, experimentation, communication, and exploration of the science. So other radio services with comparison to amateur radio, Citizens Band, which some of you are familiar with. A lot of amateur radio operators also started with Citizens Band, especially in the 70s. It's 27 megahertz, otherwise known by the amateur world as the 11-meter band. Why? Because originally that frequency allocation was an amateur radio frequency that was then given to Citizens Band as a free allocation, no-cost license essentially. They're limited to 5 watts and their line of sight is about 10 miles at that frequency. However, because of atmospheric conditions, it's possible for that in certain times of the solar cycle to go way longer than 10 miles. But by law, you're not supposed to make those kind of long distance contacts. They want to limit you to about 10 miles. However, there's no policing on the Citizens Band radio. And even at 5 watts, there are many people who operate illegally with big amplifiers on that frequency. It's not as popular as it used to be. However, it is still used. Marine VHF, you can see it's much higher in frequency than the Citizens Band, much more power, 25 watts, and they can go line of sight 20 miles or more. Those little family radio service walkie-talkies you can buy in the store, they operate in the UHF range of frequencies, and they're about half a watt, and they can go line of sight 2 miles. What do we mean by line of sight? VHF and especially UHF are line of sight devices. If you have an obstruction between you and the other person, and that obstruction is able to block the radio frequency at that UHF or VHF, then that's as far as you can go. If you're sitting in the middle of a building and the building is constructed such that it can block UHF, that family service radio may not even get out too far out of the building and be restricted to inside the warehouse, so to speak, or inside the building. And if you're out in a very mountainous terrain in the valley, you may not be able to operate for a very long distance with the FRS radio. However, they're not designed for long distance. FRS radios are designed for very short distance communications to keep people in touch with each other who are nearby. GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service, is also in the UHF range. It operates from 5 to 50 watts. It is a licensed band. You have to pay for a license. There's no test, and the license extends to your entire family. It can go 2+ miles because this radio not only has more power, but it actually allows you to set up what's called a repeater, which we'll learn about later, which allows basically the radio to talk to another radio that's located at a high point, and then that radio retransmits the signal to anyone who can see that high point. And so technically you can go further with that radio than you can with the other ones. There's also what we used to call the business band radios, which are multi-use radio service, which are again in the same very basic neighborhood as Marine VHF, 2 watts, 5+ miles. And look at amateur radio. We have from 1.8 megahertz to 250,000 megahertz is where our spectrum is located. We can go up to 1500 watts, and literally the sky is the limit. Absolutely. We can go anywhere our signal will travel around the world, and of course we can bounce it off of the ionosphere at some frequency ranges, or we can hit an amateur radio communication satellite, bounce it basically off that communication satellite and go further. So we have a lot more flexibility, a lot more band, a lot more power than other radio services do. And so on the right, you'll see some of our allocation areas in the medium frequencies, which are like AM radio band, the high frequencies known as shortwave, very high frequency, the UHF ultra high frequency. Then we have the 3.3 and 24 gigahertz area and the 47 to 241 gigahertz, exceedingly high frequency areas. Now, you notice on UHF, we have 2.4 gigahertz, and if you look at SHF, we have 5 gigahertz. So those are actually where a lot of digital Wi-Fi networks are. So yes, ham radio operators operate their own mesh networks and internet networks on their band allocations at those locations. So a little background. Amateur radio became a licensed group in 1912. Doesn't mean that we started in 1912. It means that we first got official government licenses. Up at that point, there were no real government licenses. You just made up your call sign. So there were amateur radio operators before 1912. This is just when they first were recognized and given licenses. And so then the creation of amateur radio service officially as an act happened in 1934. Ham radio got shut down during World War II. The reason for that is there was a worry that ham radio operators would be, some spies would use ham radio operation bands for spying and espionage. So therefore they shut it down for national security, and also drafted many of those radio operators into the military. So they had a core of radio operators basically were fully trained and ready to go at the beginning of World War II. And there are about 700, probably about 800,000 licenses in the United States right now. And most of those, the majority of them, are technician licenses, just like what you're going to be getting. And there are, just for contrast, over 1.4 million amateur radio operators in Japan. The United States and Japan have the most amateur radio operators per capita, and then it goes to Great Britain and some other places. But these two countries have the most amateur radio operators. And there are lots of different areas of interest. So we have emergency communications, as we've talked about already. Some of you are part of MCOM units for hospitals, so will be getting their license. You're getting your license specifically to assist that. The social connection, whether it's on the air or with clubs and other organizations. Experimentation across all the bands: HF, VHF, UHF, SHF, and EHF. Low power operation. There are many hams who love the idea of using the least amount of power to make the most contacts at the longest range. So there are people who focus on, can I operate at 5 watts? Can I operate at 10 watts? There is a network called Whisper that operates in the hundreds of milliwatt range, very, very low power. That is a global network of radios that are located, that run autonomously around the world, that are actually used to study propagation in the amateur radio community. Mesh networking for digital communications. We do space communications, as I mentioned. We can do remote operations. That is, I can be sitting at my desk in Seattle and be connected to a radio receiver and transmitter that is located in another state, another country, and operate from here. More and more that's opened up for many hams because the cities have so much radio frequency noise, it's sometimes hard to use our radios, especially in the HF area. So a lot of hams are electing to use remote operations, so they set up a station somewhere else where it's less radio noise and they can actually do their hobby more effectively. We are involved in building repeater networks, contesting, which is where you get on the air during a special period of time and you're trying to make as many contacts as you can for points. And there's single sideband or voice contesting, there's Morse code contesting. We have something called fox hunting, which is radio direction finding, where people have their own antennas that are handheld antennas like you saw in the picture earlier, and somebody sets up a very low power transmitter somewhere in a park or in a city, and the idea is to go find it. and see how well your skills are in finding it. It's kind of like geocaching about 100 years before geocaching existed. So this is not really big in the Seattle area, but in Southern California and other areas, it's a much bigger sport. WAS stands for Worked All States, so there's specific kinds of awards you can go after by the ARRL and others. So if you can document that you had a contact in every state in the United States, you can get a certificate, or every county in the United States, you get a certificate. All the what's called DX countries, you can get a certificate. So there's a lot of different ways of competing, so to speak, or getting recognized for your achievements if you want to go that route. A lot of people do it yourself. People build their own radios. They investigate software-defined radios, and a lot of people build their own antennas. It's not difficult to build an antenna. It doesn't even take a lot of tools to do it, and you can buy commercial antennas, but some people build their own. So again, it's how you want to find yourself in the hobby. And what you start out doing in this hobby when you first get licensed changes over time. You might stay as doing MCOM, and that's all you want to do. And other people, as they explore other parts of the hobby and might get very much involved in mesh network. Some people might get involved in antenna design. They may then change later to get more involved in space communications. It's a lifelong learning hobby. And as you can see, we even have the ability to do amateur TV. Now that's not the TV where we're going to do programming and broadcasting. I'm actually sending picture and voice in real time across the radio spectrum like a TV signal, but we don't broadcast. We don't just do programming. We're talking to each other through amateur TV. And of course, digital communications like Morse code, which is the first digital communicating media, RTTY, which is called radio teletype, PSK is a modulation mode, Pactor is a computer mode, etc. So we have 16 to 25 different digital communications modes we can choose from. So it's a really wide hobby. It's a lifelong hobby. People who get their ham radio license, generally speaking, they come and go from the hobby over time because of life gets in the way sometimes of the hobby. But there are people who are licensed when they're 15. They are still amateur operators into their 90s. And still active on the bands. There are people who are disabled, who are blind, who are still using their ham radio license and operating and connecting with people. So we're under Title 47, Part 97 of the federal regulations, and every amateur radio operator is supposed to have a copy of Part 97 somewhere near their station. So many of us carry Part 97s, if you want to be technically legal, Part 97 copies as a PDF on their phones or on their home computers or on their tablets. And this is just sort of one of those things where you're supposed to have it. Most people have a copy somewhere. How often they look at it, I don't know. The FCC is not in the role anymore of really policing this kind of stuff, so they're not going to knock on your door and say, can I see your Part 97? It just assumed that you're going to have a copy available to you of a Part 97, and if you have internet connection, you automatically have Part 97 because you can always just go into search engine and say Title 47, Federal Regulation, Part 97, Amateur Radio, and you'll be able to get the PDF sitting there on your screen. So it's not a big worry. It's just you might see it where it says, do you agree to have a copy of Part 97? The answer is yes. We're under the jurisdiction of FCC. They coordinate also with the International Telecommunications Union, and there are other amateur radio organizations, like in the United States, the ARRL, the Amateur Radio Relay League, and other agencies around amateur radio operation groups around the world. We formed the International Amateur Radio Union to work on amateur radio across the globe, and specifically to advise the International Telecommunications Union and lobby for our spectrum with them. So there's another number of organizations that are always fighting to make sure we maintain our spectrum. Yes, our spectrum, a little history. A lot of the amateur bands we got many, many decades ago were considered junk bands. Nobody knew what to do with them. Nobody thought that anyone would ever have a use for them. So they said, let's put the amateur radio operators on those bands, especially up in the UHF, UHF, and SHF and EHF section. Well, it turns out those are very valuable bands because with digital communications like cell phones and other things like that, that bandwidth is very useful. And so periodically, the federal government will try to get that bandwidth and take it away from the amateur radio operators, and they have been successful in some cases, and they auction it off to get billions of dollars. So what was once a junk bands are now becoming worth billions of dollars to the FCC. We have allocations in the 900 megahertz band. Right now, there is a petition going on by a company that wants to take over that allocation and take it away from amateur radio for use in location services. And so there is the ARRL on our behalf as a community of hams is going to the Federal Communications to say, no, that's our band. We use it. This is how we use it. And so please don't take it away from us or modify it. We'll see how that turns out. Technically, we're not called ham radio. We're called the Amateur Radio Service. So by Part 97, we are the Amateur Radio Service. And that's a really big piece of word there, service, because we do provide a service. That providing a service gives us an advantage over using a cell phone. When you're driving, we don't want distracted driving, by the way. We're not encouraging distracted driving. However, if you are driving and you need to operate your ham radio for some reason, that is not illegal. Check with your local state in case it gets changed, but that is not illegal because you are a service. And the service specifically is you can use that radio because you are technically part of an emergency response. All amateur radios have the ability to support a disaster response. Therefore, you, when you're operating your radio on the car, get the privilege of that because you potentially could be supporting emergency services sometime in the future. That's why what we're told, you'll hear me say later in the class, when you get your license, you will print out a copy of your license. One of those copies will go in your wallet or your purse and on you at all times. That way, whenever you're operating your radio, if you're stopped by a police officer for distracted driving, hopefully when you're using your radio, you pull over, but there are times you may not, and you want to operate safely at all times. But if they pull you over and you say, hey, this is not a cell phone, it's an amateur radio, here's my license, I'm exempt from the law, they may still write you a ticket because they may not understand, but at least when you go to court, you can say, here's my license. You might want to have that officer write on their ticket that you presented them your license, so there's proof that you had your license with you and showed it to him or her. So do carry your license. Do make sure if you're pulled over for using your radio that you can get them to document in some way that you had your license and showed it to them. And that way, most likely, if you go to court, if they actually write you a ticket and go to court, you'll basically get a get out of jail free card, so to speak. Okay, going on. More about the introductory stuff. Testing. So the FCC, as I mentioned before, delegated testing to the volunteer examiners. And there are 14 clubs or organizations across the United States who operate as the volunteer examiner coordinators for the nationwide. There are, of these groups, there's a number that actually do the VE, the volunteer examiner certification. So I am a VE, I'm a voluntary examiner. I am certified by the ARRL as a voluntary examiner. There are other groups have their own certifications for being a VE. So the VEs, the VECs are also the ones who control the question pool. And so every number of years, every couple of years, they revise the question pool to keep abreast of changes in amateur radio. The test costs $15 if it's administered by the ARRL to handle processing. And what was changed about 3 years ago is before there was no charge by the FCC for our licenses. So about 3 years ago, the FCC said, look, we're going to charge you $35 to get your license the first time. And so when you get your license, your actually total cost is going to be about $50 altogether. However, if you're less than 18 years of age, ask your instructor because the ARRL has a pool of money for people who are under 18 to pay that $35 charge. The technician and the general test are 35 questions each. You need 26 to pass, and the extra is 50 questions, and you have to have 37 to pass. Now, after you pass the test, you become authorized by the FCC via the Uniform Licensing Service, Uniform Licensing System, and there's the address, the URL for that. What will happen is after you pass the test, the FCC will notify you by email that says, hey, To make your license active, you're going to have to pay $35. Once you pay that, your license will show up in the ULS. Once you are in the ULS, you are a licensed amateur radio operator. And you'll see a link on the ULS to print out your paper license for home, and of course, as I said, a wallet version for your purse. Some places offer to have your wallet made into a plastic card. I have one of those, so that it's not as fragile. And then you're free to get on the air and of course, following the rules. Different ways of getting on the air. My first contact as an amateur radio technician, or amateur radio, I got tech in general at the same time, licensed amateur, was actually before I had a radio, because there's something called Echolink, which connects those who wish to can connect their VHF, UHF repeaters to an internet system that connects them together. So what I did was, my first contact was on my computer. I connected to a remote repeater in the United States. I called out for anyone who would like to talk to me. Someone came back to me in another state, and we had a conversation, and then I closed off the link. So my first contact was actually not with a radio. It was through the computer, going to a radio remotely, remote operation through the radio, and then talking to somebody in that location, where the last leg was all through RF, radio frequency. So that was my first contact. Things you can't do. Cannot conduct business with your radios, ever, ever. That's called pecuniary interest. So you may not conduct any business. Now, what's exempt from that is if I am talking to somebody on the radio, or we have a group of people talking together, and they say, hey, let's, I have a radio I want to sell, and you say, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to have that radio, or I want to sell an antenna, and so those things are called swap meets. That's allowed, but if you were to operate your own business, or talk to people, use it for managing your warehouse, the radios, or for talking to clients, whatever, coordinating at the work site, that is conducting business, so you cannot do that. That's illegal. You can't use amateur radio as part of your job. That is, you can't get paid to do amateur radio as part of your job, except for people like who work in hospitals during a disaster. Those people who are licensed amateur radios in the hospitals are exempt and can operate their amateur radios while they're being employed during a disaster situation. You cannot transmit a message to a third party in a foreign country where an agreement hasn't been made with the U.S. You can see that link to get information on where that is allowed. Third-party messaging does not mean I can talk to someone in Britain, someone in France, someone in Japan, and to Indonesia. Any other ham I'm talking to is not third party. It's just he and I, or he and she, me and her, having a conversation. However, if I'm saying, would you send a message to Fred, who's not an amateur radio operator, in your country for me, that's third party communication. So in that case, or vice versa. So in that case, you have to check the list to make sure if that's allowed. Also, sometimes there are banned governments, that is, countries you cannot talk to at all. Currently, there are no banned countries. So you can talk to North Korea. If they had an amateur radio operator, which I doubt, you could talk to them technically. The last time there was a banned country was during the Vietnam War. You could not talk to North Vietnam as an amateur radio operator. So call signs, when you pass your test and you pay your $35, you'll get a call sign. If you're getting licensed in Washington State, your AFCC will issue you a K license. So east of the Mississippi, you'll get a W license. West of the Mississippi, you get a K license. And there'll be, because we live in Section 7, you will get a 7 with your call sign. So if you look down where it says my original call sign, 9-2008, you'll see mine says KE7VMS, Kilo Echo 7, Victor, Mary, Sierra. So that is my original call sign. And I think the next one, right now we're up to KLs, I think. Usually the first two letters tell you where, they're sequential in a lot of respects. So right now they're on KLs, I think. So I paid some extra money to get a vanity call sign. So if you notice, it says in the top left, my call sign today is Whiskey 7 Delta Alpha Oscar, which is David A. Okrent. So I have my initials as my call sign. And I'm not obligated to be a K, because with a vanity call sign, I can choose whatever available call sign there is. So even though I live west of the Mississippi, the K7 DAO was taken, so I had to get W7 DAO. Because I'm an extra class license, I have a special designator I'm allowed to use called an N. So my license could be N7DAO. However, N7DAO is taken. So that's why I'm a W7DAO. If I could get N indicates I'm an extra class operator. It's one of the, there are only two designators that allow you to use a special letter at the front. One is if you're an advanced operator, which has been phased out. There are only people who got their advanced and have not moved to extra who still are A's. So an A would be an advanced, an N is an extra. Everybody else is either a W or a K to start with. In some cases, when an amateur family member who is an amateur radio operator passes, it's possible for you to claim as a family member their call sign. So if you contact the FCC and say, hey, look, I want to change my call sign, I'll pay the fee as a vanity, but I would like my father or my mother's or my grandfather's call sign. It's open since they just passed. The FCC will give you priority for that call sign, and you'll be able to keep the call sign in the family. There's some people who do that generationally. So just so you understand that that's there. Also, the URL below is the URL to Universal Licensing System. So that's where you'll go after your test to check when you are licensed and when it's in the FCC database, and where you go to pay your $35 fee. So can you be fined for illegal operations? Yes, you can. It's not often that it happens. You have to be very, very blatant and ignore lots of warnings before they'll fine you, but they will fine you. They will seize your equipment. They will take your license. So you have to stay within the rules. Make sure your station is secure from unlawful operation in your absence. I have a ham radio in my car. When I take my car to the service shop, I take the microphone away from the radio so it cannot be operated with I'm not there. You cannot interfere with primary frequency owners. So there's some frequencies that we share as secondary users. When we're a secondary user, we cannot interfere with the primary frequency owner. If there's a primary frequency owner there, we leave that section of the band. We do not operate when they're operating. It's very rare that you will find that happen, but you cannot interfere with them or you can be fined. You can't broadcast. So broadcast is like tuning into a radio station. They're just transmitting to anybody who can hear them and in a way that is scheduled or even non-scheduled, but it's a one-way transmission. We do not do one-way transmissions except when we're calling out saying, is anyone there? Which is called CQ on the shortwave bands, or it's called break or monitoring on the VHF, UHF bands. So we do not generally do one-way transmissions. We're trying to find a conversation, have a conversation with somebody. You do have to maintain your contact information in the Uniform Licensing System database, whether it's a PO box or your home address. As you change those, you need to update that. Technically speaking, your station is open to be inspected by the FCC. So if you're blatantly causing a problem, you might get that knock on the door and they may say, we'd like to see your station. There's something wrong here. And you basically have given them the right because you're licensed to do that. We do not have to keep logbooks anymore. So years ago, every amateur radio operator had to keep a logbook to log every contact they made, and it was open to inspection by the FCC. You had to keep it for about 3 years. And that log was to make sure you were not conducting espionage. I guess that was the reason. Or who you were contacting. Were you contacting someone from an illegal country that you weren't supposed to contact? I don't know. You wouldn't put that in anyway, but what can I say? But that was done away with. So you do not have to keep a log anymore of your contacts. The only time people keep a log is for their own use or for contests. When contests, you have to keep a log. Or a lot of people still keep their log for their own use because they like to know who they've talked to in the past and how far away they are and their signal strength and things like that. So oftentimes people still keep logs. There is still what's called QSL cards, especially for shortwave, where there are contact cards. So let's say I made a contact with somebody in Japan. They might send me a card saying, on this date, at this frequency, we connected with each other. Here's the signal strength that I heard. Here's the signal strength you said I was. I would then have that card. It's a postcard, and I might write a postcard in return confirming, yes, we did have that. In the old days, this was really common if you wanted to confirm that you had a contact when you're trying to go for an award. Today, there used to be paper QSL cards, and there's still some people who have them and use them. But today, almost all that is digital. So you can send a PDF version of the card if you wanted to, but some of the modern logging software automatically send that for you digitally and confirm it. So a lot less QSL cards today. A lot of people might see pictures of old ham radio shacks and they've decorated their entire wall like wallpaper with their QSL cards. And everybody's QSL card was personalized to what they want to have on it. So they're kind of unique things. So they're kind of fun to see if you ever find them. So how do you know where you are, or how do you know where somebody else is? So QTH is one of our codes. We have Q codes in amateur radio, like CB had the 10 codes. We have Q codes. And what were they for? To make communication efficient when you're using Morse code. So you can take recurring statements or questions and turn them into a code so it's faster to transmit by Morse code. We still use Q codes. On voice, we will use only maybe 5 or 6 Q codes. In Morse code, you might see up to 10 to 12 Q codes still being used. But we still use them. So somebody might say, what's your QTH? And that means where you're located. In CB, that would be 1020. So we have different ways of locating where we are. We have the ITU region, the International Telecommunications Union, U.S. sections, excuse me. We could be substating, which is like Washington State is divided into 2. WWA is Western Washington, EWA is Eastern Washington. We have something called the Maidenhead grid system that tells us how to locate ourselves, our city, and of course lat and longitude are always helpful. So ITU regions, we are in region 2. There are 3 regions. The operating rules for each region are slightly different, and if you're operating from those regions, regardless of where you're licensed, if you're operating in those regions, you must adhere to their requirements for that region. So somebody says, well, what's your ITU region? Because there are some times when you in a contest you might be saying what that is. So I would say region 2. And somebody else would say region 3. The FCC has divided the country up into sections, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 9, 8, etc. sections. We are in section 7. Section 6 is California. Now, in the old days, if you were licensed in Section 7 and moved to Section 3, you would have to change your call sign you would go to the FCC and find an open call sign that would give you a Section 3 number. If you moved then to Section 4, you would go back to the FCC, find a call sign that would have a 4 in it. Today, they do not do that. So if you live in Section 7 and you move to Section 3, you may retain your Section 7. You can still change it to a Section 3. That's up to you. It's your option. You're not required anymore to do that, but you are able to retain your call sign. And so sometimes you might hear somebody like in Washington say, I'm W5 something, and you know they live in Washington. They just haven't changed their call sign. And some people might say something called slash, W7DAO/3, which means I'm a W7, but I'm operating in region 3. If you live in a location, that doesn't always happen, but if you're operating portably, you're traveling with your radio, you might say /0/5 to indicate that you're not in the location that you live in. Things to keep in mind is Alaska and Hawaii and the Pacific have a special call sign, so please look at those, the KL7s and the KH6s, and so take a look at that because there is in the question pool questions about those call signs. So again, you can see the U.S. call signs begin with K, N, W, and AA or AL, or through AL for advanced classes. This is the Maidenhead grid square locator system used by everyone across the globe, generally used for VHF, UHF work. And this basically divides the world into a number of sections, and when you're communicating for example, in contests where they need to know what section you are, you'll say CN87. Or if you want to get even more accurate, it does subdivide further, and you can, in my case, where I live, I'm in CN87, and I can say divide that into further subsections to become CN87 Uniform Mary. And that would tell people a lot closer where I am. Why would I not say, well, I live in South Seattle? Well, this makes sense to anybody around the world. They can it gives them an idea of where you are. Why is that important? Because one, they may be working towards trying to get every grid square that has a radio operator in it, or it's also a very quick way of saying how far you are. There are computer programs, loggers, now that will take that code and tell you exactly how many miles or kilometers you are from that person when you called. So there's all sorts of things. That's just really a shorthand, so we don't just worry about language. People are listening for CN87 or KJ or 42. They're listening for those, and so it's a lot less than saying some complex name that you may have that doesn't go well with people from other countries trying to figure out what you're saying. So can you operate at sea, in the air, overseas? Absolutely. If you own a ship, you own an aircraft, you're the person in command, you can set, and you're registered in the United States, you can use your ham radio on your boat, you can use your ham radio on in your airplane. However, if you're traveling on any vessel craft that's registered in the United States that's not owned by you, you can go to the airplane's pilot, who's the pilot in command, and say, hey, I'd like to operate my radio from here. Do you mind? And they might say, no way, or they might say yes. You can go to a ship's captain and say, I'd like to operate my ham radio from this cruise ship. And they might say to you, yeah, go ahead and do that, as long as they're registered in the U.S., because that becomes U.S. territory. Most ships, just so you know, are not registered in the United States. They're registered in other countries. So only as a U.S. operator can you operate from these vessels when they are registered in the United States. So operating overseas, the country must permit amateur radio operation. You must have permission, and you can operate under you have to operate under their rules. So if you're temporarily in another country, there are reciprocal operating agreements that allow you to operate temporarily in those countries. So you want to go to the FCC or the ARRL and check out things like the ARP, the CRT in Europe, and the reciprocal operating agreements to find out where you can operate without having to take a test and get a license for that country temporarily. If you're going to be living in that country, you need to get another license. My buddy is just moved to Panama. That's going to be his permanent residence. He is in the process of getting an amateur license for Panama. There's reciprocity, so therefore he will not have to take another test. He just has to pay money, fill out some forms, and they will give him a license with class privileges as close to extra as they have for their country. And then he'll be able to operate with, and they'll issue him a Panamanian call sign. So he'll have two call signs, an American call sign when he's in the United States, and he'll have a Panamanian call sign when he's operating in Panama. Okay, before we jump into the deep end. By the way, if you were taking the class, you know we've taken some breaks about this time, so we're just going to keep through in this re-recording. So before we get into the deep end, first question, do I really need to know this stuff if I just want to use an HT, a handy-talkie? So if your goal is to buy a dual band VHF handy-talkie or a single band, you don't obligate to get dual band, and use it for local communications, you really are not going to need the depth that we're going to go into for the rest of the next two sessions. However, you do need this information to pass the test. So therefore, even if you may never use some of this depth again, you still need it to pass the test. Why? Because we want a certain amount of proficiency in the technology for all ham radio operators. Second, you may start with an HT, but as you can see, there's a big world out there and many different things around ham radio. And if you get the bug and you want to do more, this provides a future foundation. You might stay with technician for the entire time that you're an amateur operator. However, you might go into mesh networking. You may go into exploration of using gigahertz communications in the high gigahertz ranges, which are really interesting and cool. And so this just provides you a foundation to work from in the future as you progress in the hobby. So let's talk about, what do I need to do? I just want to get on the air with an HT. That's all I really want to do. Okay, not a problem. Almost all of us have them as well. To get a good quality average HT, it's going to range between $100 and $160. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little less, depends on what you want. There's a huge amount of used equipment out there. It's good used equipment. Most of the stuff is good. I have bought most of my amateur equipment used. Haven't had any problem with it, and that's pretty much the experience of many people. We tend to take care of our equipment really well, and so it has good value for long periods of time. My handheld radio, one of my handheld radios, is the one here called the Yaesu VX7R, which is the second one from the left. I bought it used. It's around $225 today. By the way, that radio was about probably $250 when it was new, so it has pretty good residual value. It does 6 meters, 2 meters, 1.25 meters, and 70 centimeters, which you'll find out about a little bit later today, what that means. And it's about $225. If I sold it again today, probably get the same amount of money. The other two radios on the right are current new radios. They have a lot more capabilities to do many other functions, so they cost a bit more. But do you need them? Well, not necessarily. You could, if you're, again, it depends on what you want to do. And the more fancy things you want to do, the more expensive the radio will become. And again, there are radios that will be used on the market that have similar capabilities. The one on the far left is a Baofeng. It's a Chinese radio. You'll see lots of Chinese radios on the market in the handheld range. They all look similar to this. You'll see them as UV, Uniform Victor, UV5s. Now here's the thing about these Chinese radios. Most of them are not FCC compliant. So although they're good, they're cheap, they don't have the necessary filtering, all of them, to be compliant with what's called spurious emissions. That is, interfering with other bands when you're transmitting. So even though amateur operators often get these cheap radios, they take the risk of operating potentially illegally. I say potentially because some do pass, some don't pass. They just don't have official FCC compliance certification. However, the Baofeng GT5R is legal. It is FCC compliant. So if you're interested in these radios, which again, they're fine, they're good. I own one. I own a GT5R as well as the VX7R. They're very cheap. It's a great entry-level radio between $18 and $30. 5 watts. It'll operate the repeaters. It'll operate simplex. It's dual band. It's not true to receivers like the other radios on the right. They have 2 separate receivers. This switches back and forth between 2 receivers. But for most people as an entry-level radio, it's great. Serve you really well. But again, look to make sure that it's FCC compliant. And again, the GT5R is compliant. So just so you know, you can get into this hobby as little as $18, or the sky's the limit. So just so you understand. And nothing says you have to jump in with a very expensive radio to start with. Start with what you learn with, and as you learn more, you decide to expand. Great. If you decide that's fine, great. Okay, so let's start with signal fundamentals. This is basically a picture of my current radio. Not my fingers, but it is somebody's. It's the FT991A. It's a shack in the box, as you can see in the top right. It's HF, VHF, and UHF all-mode transceiver. It is my go-to radio for shortwave operation for the most of the part, and so it looks very complicated, but you'll find that when you take a general class and start using more of the HF rigs, you'll find that a lot of these things are the same in every radio. You just have to figure out how to get to them. And it ends up being that you're only, at any given time, you might only be using 5 buttons. And just some special things occasionally. But for the most time, you can operate a rig fairly quickly. If you have experience with one rig, you can operate pretty much any rig just by getting oriented very quickly to how they get to things. But they all have very similar controls. So signal fundamentals. Here's Heinrich Hertz. He's the one who invented, or discovered, I should say, radio waves. But he thought they didn't have any practical application. So sometimes the inventor doesn't really see or the discoverer doesn't really see their application. What you're looking at is a spark gap generator, a spark gap transmitter. So when you have a spark, it creates lots of radio frequency across a large spectrum. It's like literally a lightning bolt, going across, and it creates lots and lots of radio frequency harmonics or different frequencies. And so what he discovered is if he created that spark, that other loop on the side, on the left, number 3, would be able to pick it up and be able to decode that as either on or off. Well, on or off, we already had an on and off type of technology before we had this principle. This was discovered, and that was telegraphy. So Morse code is on and off. So if you can turn the spark gap generator on or off, you can communicate without direct wires between the two things, between the transmitter and receiver. We don't need to have any wires because the on and off is creating a RF radio frequency impulse that's being picked up by another unit as a receiver. So this is the basis of radio waves, and the fact that we're turning, at least at the most basic level, we're just turning an RF generator on and turning it off. Doing that, we can send Morse code, and all the original radio was Morse code. And this is what was happening. Of course, it's not a very great way of doing it. It's like you're pushing out a huge amount of energy across a large spectrum. It would have been much more efficient, which is what evolved very quickly. It's more efficient to push out energy at one specific frequency than it is to flood the airwaves across it. So it's more efficient energy-wise. And so what's intelligence and radio frequency? You already know the terms transmitting and receiving, but to be clear on the definition, transmitting is the process of coding information into an electromagnetic wave of sufficient frequency energy to radiate. We call that a carrier wave. So when we start with a frequency, an energy wave that has sufficient energy to radiate, which we call a carrier wave. The receiver picks up that carrier wave that has intelligence embedded with it, and it separates the intelligence from the carrier wave. So transmitting, we take the intelligence, we basically use it to alter a carrier wave. We send that carrier wave through the air to where a receiving station picks it up, and the receiver then removes the carrier wave and leaves the information, and then you hear the voice or the Morse code or whatever, the digital, which is the intelligence that was originally sent on the carrier wave. So that's transmitting and receiving. So let's look at anatomy of a radio wave. We use the sine wave as one of the illustrations of a radio wave. It's an electromagnetic field, which is sufficient energy and frequency, as I said before, to enable it to radiate into space via an antenna. You'll notice that we have in the diagram something called period or one cycle. That is from 0 to the peak, back to 0 to the valley maximum, back to 0 is one cycle. That one cycle is the frequency. So how fast that changes over 1 second is the frequency. So if I only had one of those cycles every 1 second, it would be 1 cycle per second, or 1 hertz, because we named the number of cycles per second after hertz. If I had 1,000 of those cycles happening in 1 second, it'd be 1,000 hertz. If I had 10,000 cycles like that happening in 1 second, it would be 10,000 hertz. And of course, the amplitude we use is the positive amplitude when we talk about amplitude in this case, and it is the peak of the waveform. The wavelength, which is exactly the same as in time frame, it's exactly as one cycle, but the wavelength is considered from peak to peak. Notice I didn't say trough to trough, it's peak to peak. It's exactly the same time frame as one cycle is shown on the screen. And you notice it has what's called direction of travel because it's moving through time. Remember, this wave is going through space and time. So the minimum radio frequency by the book to have for radio frequency for RF is 20,000 hertz, or 20 times 1,000, which can be expressed as 20 times 10 to the third in scientific notation. We use kilo to represent 1,000, so, or 10 to the third. So therefore, we can write this as 20 kHz, kilohertz, 20 kilohertz. Okay, and the K in this case is not uppercase, it's lowercase. And the reason we do that is because in science there is another unit that has a K, and it's called Kelvin. It's a temperature scale, and that is named after Lord Kelvin, and so it's a capital K. And so to differentiate it, we use for kilo a lowercase k. Just a little trivia, it's not in the book, it's not on the test. But one other thing to keep in mind is although we show a radio wave in 2 dimensions as a sine wave, it really isn't in 2 dimensions, it's traveling through space, it's in 3 dimensions. And so the RF, the electromagnetic field is traveling in 3 dimensions. It's sort of like tide pushing you in the surf. It goes in, it goes out, there's a peak and there's a trough. And so if you were to take a 2-dimensional slice through this diagram that you're seeing here, then you would see a sine wave. But just keep in mind it's radiating out across 3-dimensional space and time. So RF is energy that moves through space without a medium. It does not need anything to push against. It is its own energy packet that's traveling in space. Although we use sound as an analogy to RF, like the ripples when you drop a pebble into a lake, we often use sound as an analogy for that waveform. Sound is not RF. Sound is a pressure wave. It's mechanical motion. It requires a medium like air or water or a solid to travel through. It has to move molecules in order to propagate. RF energy does not have to move molecules to propagate because it's energy. What does this mean? Well, very simply, if you watch a sci-fi movie where they're having battle scenes in space and they're making all sorts of rocket noises and phaser noises and torpedo noises, the answer is there is no noise. As they say in space, no one can hear you scream because there's not enough density of particles for sound to move in space. So essentially, sound in space is silence for the most part. RF energy, and the universe is full of RF energy, is, if you translate that into the audio frequencies, it's very noisy. There's a lot of RF energy, but it doesn't require molecules to push against. It's its own energy packets traveling through space and time. So each electromagnetic wave, RF wave, has two components, an E component, the electrical component, and a magnetic field that travels with it. So wherever there's an electrical field, there's a magnetic field. And so at a right angle to the electrical field in a wave, there's a magnetic wave. We call that magnetic wave the H wave. So again, this is deeper than the book, but just so you know that that's present. And so these radio waves can be described using sine and cosine functions from trigonometry. So frequency and wavelength, or what I say, tomato versus tomato. The symbol for wavelength is lambda, and lambda is equal to the speed of light, c, just like E equals mc squared. C is the speed of light divided by the frequency. We know the frequency is the period, how many cycles in 1 second occurs. The wavelength, which is related to the cycle, is basically related to how far that wavelength travels over time. So to be more specific, as the radio frequency increases, the wavelength decreases and vice versa. So when that period, remember we're traveling in time and space. So one cycle or one wavelength is the time, in that time that occurred, the wave has moved in space. So from going from time 0 to time, let's say 1, in that one interval of time, the wave has physically moved in space. And it's moved in space a number of meters. So it turns out that that formula tells us how far that wave has traveled in 1 second. Using radio waves travel the speed of light, 300 million meters per second, or 3 times 10 to the 8th. And so if I were to travel at a high frequency, I would go, let's say, a distance, that is a high frequency being, let's say, 1,000,000 cycles per second, I would go, let's say, x feet. If I traveled at 500,000 cycles per second, I would be traveling at a distance of 2 times x feet. If I was traveling at 2,000,000 cycles per second, then I would, relative to where I started with 1,000,000, I'd be traveling half the distance in that 1 second. So there's a relationship between frequency and wavelength. One is actually the inverse, essentially, of the other. So that's why it's tomato-tomato. So wavelength and frequency are related because really they're an inverse of each other relative to using the constant, the speed of light. And that tells us how far a wave at a given frequency travels through space over 1 second. This little formula is very important. So let's solve for lambda equals c over f, where c is the speed of light. Again, it's 300 million meters per second, and f is in hertz or cycles per second. So if we want to express frequency in millions of hertz, then we would have an equation like 3 times 10 to the 8th, that's the 300 million meters per second, divided by the frequency times 1,000,000. So if I have a 1 million hertz frequency, then it'd be 3 times 10 to the 8th over 1 million, or 1 times 10 to the 6th. Well, doing the math in scientific notation, when we have divide exponents in scientific notation, we actually subtract them. So 10 to the 8th minus 10 to the 6th, we subtract the exponents and get 10 to the 2nd. 10 to the 2nd is 100. 3 times 10 to the 2nd is 300. So by canceling out that large number of millions of hertz and the zeros and a large number of meters per second, we get a formula like 300 divided by f will give us what the wavelength is. So moving things around, because we can do that algebraically very easy across the equal sign, we get 300 equals lambda, the wavelength in meters, times the frequency in millions of hertz. And so what we can do is draw the circle, which you may have seen on the YouTube or in the book. You draw the circle, since the 300 is on the left side of the equation, so we put it at the top box. And because the frequency of megahertz and lambda are on the right side, we put them on the lower two boxes. And we know that if anything's vertical, it's going to be division. Anything horizontal is going to be multiplication. So we can cover the unknown with our finger, and the equation that we need to do to solve the problem appears. So if we cover megahertz because we don't know what the frequency is, the equation becomes 300 divided by lambda in meters. If we cover the lambda, and the equation then becomes 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. Now in this case, we would never need to cover 300 to figure out what that is, because it'll always be 300. But in other equations, as we talked about in the other video, you could calculate 300 by just multiplying the megahertz times the lambda, and you will get back to pretty close to 300. Which, so in other equations, we won't know it's 300, and so you can solve for that unknown if you wish. So how far does a 446 megahertz wave travel in 1 second? Well, we don't know how far it travels, so we cover the lambda, the meters. We divide 300 by the frequency, and we will get 26 inches, or 62.7 centimeters, because or 0.627 meters because the actual numbers are meters. So we would get 6.627 meters, and then we can convert that to inches if we wish. If a wave travels 20 meters in 1 second, what is its frequency? We then cover the lambda. Okay, we cover the megahertz, and we solve for 300 divided by the wavelength in meters, and we'll get 14.28 megahertz. There's no algebra involved. We just use a circle, cover the unknown, and get the equation. So bands and frequencies. In amateur radio, the wavelength loosely refers to the band. I'm going to tell you why in a second why it's loosely refers to the band, and that's like being a neighborhood. It's like me saying, I live in Seattle, that's the neighborhood, or I live in South Seattle, that's the neighborhood. And then frequency is a specific location, like my house number. Oh, I live in Seattle at 5109. Okay, that's my house number that tells you where I live. I'm not going to give you the street name, but the house number and the street name are basically the frequency. So wavelength is the neighborhood, frequency is your specific house location. So you would say, I'm operating on 20 meters. Now I say that loosely because it turns out we rounded a lot of these bands for amateur radio into whole numbers. So there's the 160 meter band, the 80 meter band, the 40 meter band, the 20 meter band, the 10 meter band, etc. Well, if you actually calculate the range of frequencies in those bands, it may not be exactly 20 meters. In fact, it really could be referred to as the 21 meter band to be accurate. But we like whole numbers, so we call it the 20 meter band. It's in the neighborhood, right? It's in the neighborhood. So if I want to tell you to meet me somewhere in that neighborhood, I'm not going to say meet me in 20 meters because it doesn't tell you where in 20 meters I am, because it ranges from 14.0 megahertz to 14.35 megahertz. It doesn't tell you where I am in that neighborhood. So I would say to you, I'll meet you at a specific frequency. In this case, for VHF operations, I'll meet you at 146.55 megahertz. That's my exact space I'm going to be in that 2 meter band. I don't say I'm going to meet you at 2.047 meters, because your radio dial is not designed in meters, it's designed in frequencies. So therefore I would say meet me at 146.55. So again, bands are like neighborhoods, frequencies is like your house number. Now, what's cool about this formula, lambda equals C or F, or 300 equals lambda times the frequency, what's really cool about this, it turns out that wavelength relationship is really important to antenna design. because antennas loosely are like tuning forks. They resonate at one frequency. That is, they're optimized for one frequency based on their physical characteristics. And the wavelength influences the length of the antenna. Higher frequency antennas are shorter than lower ones. So if you look here on the right, you'll see 146 megahertz. This antenna is 80 inches long. And this antenna is optimized for 146 megahertz. Doesn't mean this antenna is not picking up energy across a large amount of the spectrum. It just means it has the ability to pick up the most energy at 100 or transmit the most energy at 146 megahertz. And we'll get into more detail later about these are more abstractions at this case than details. On the other hand, an antenna designed and optimized for 446 megahertz is only 26 inches long. Why? Because it's designed to resonate at a higher frequency, therefore it is a smaller antenna. And does it mean it only picks up 446? No, it can pick up a lot of energy. However, it's only optimized to maximize the reception of 446 megahertz. So length of antenna is related to the wavelength of the frequency. Last thing in this area is phase is the start of a cycle relative to a reference point. So if we look at the cycle moving through space, we can say it's starting at 0 degrees, going up to 90 degrees, going back to 0, going down to 270, going back to 0 degrees. So relative to that motion on that axis of time as degrees, if we had another wave coming in at the same frequency, for example, but it was slightly delayed, then in reference to the original to the signal, the reference signal, we would be a phase difference. It could be a phase difference of 10 degrees, 45 degrees, 9 degrees, even up to 180 degrees phase difference. So that phase difference, when they come together into an antenna or in the radio in some way, the waveforms can either algebraically add or subtract from each other. So you see constructive interference is when the waves are perfectly in sync, that is, there's zero phase difference, then they add together. If they're 180 degrees out of phase, that means they're completely opposite from each other. Then if you look at it, if you subtract the peak from a trough, you get 0. And then you can have any, wherever the phase is will determine that. So waveforms can add or subtract when interacting together. And for example, the cause of fading in and out on AM signals is from this. You have two AM signals from the same station hitting the antenna at the same time, but one may have traveled longer to get to your antenna than the other because the radio waves can bounce around and rebounce. So you can have a signal that's coming in from the AM station and then the same signal coming from the AM station, but it took longer to get to you, and now they're out of phase. And because they're out of phase, they're going to subtract or add to each other. So sometimes the sound will go higher, more volume, and sometimes it might disappear completely, and anywhere in between as these waveforms are subtracting or adding to each other because they're out of phase. If they're in phase, they'd just be all adding to each other. So we're almost at the home stretch here. Very low frequency, super high frequency. This is the spectrums that we deal with. VLF, LF, MF. So very low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, exceedingly high frequency, and super high frequency. And we have allocations in pretty much all those areas. But I want you to look at the pattern. 3, 30, 300, 3, 30, 300, 3, 30, 300. This is how you remember the dividers. 3 kilohertz to 30 kilohertz is VLF. 30 to 300 is LF. 300 to 3 megahertz is MF. So you can then start to see for how we divide it up. So if someone said, hey, what is the range for VHF? You can say, oh, that's going to be a 30 to 300, or it's, so it's not difficult to reproduce this chart from memory because you have this pattern of 330, 300, 330, 300, 330, 300, and you can see that 3 times 10, 3 kilohertz times 10 is 30 kilohertz. 100 times 3 kilohertz is 300 kilohertz, or if you want to do it, it's all tens. 3 kilohertz times 10 is 30 kilohertz. 30 kilohertz times 10 is 300 kilohertz. 300 kilohertz times 10 is 3 megahertz. 3 megahertz times 10 is 30 megahertz, and so on and so forth. So you can reproduce this if you're asked a question about the spectrum. So that ends session one. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and we'll take it up to session two next time. Have a good day.